Hi everyone, I'm Greg Scobie, the Regional Fisheries Manager for IDFG in the Salmon region. Thanks for tuning in tonight as I talk about our Chinook salmon fisheries in the Upper Salmon River. Tonight I'd like to talk to you about the season setting process and the 2021 forecast. Joe talked about the season setting process in general and mentioned the Chinook forecasts across the state, and I'll circle back to that later in the presentation. It's a bit early for us to have too much data right now about the 2021 return to the Upper Salmon, but I'd like to talk a bit about the process we go through and the considerations we have to make when opening Chinook seasons in the Upper Salmon. This process is similar to what Joe just talked about, but there are some distinct differences and challenges that we have to deal with. Early in the year, we operate basically on the same timeline as other fisheries across the state. Forecasts are developed over the winter during December and January. After that, we have annual meetings with our hatchery staff to discuss our operating plans and finalize our broodstock needs. So that's kind of where we stand right now, being mid-February. And as these seasons get proposed and established in areas downriver, we're waiting and watching for Chinook destined for the Upper Salmon River to start passing over Bonneville Dam. This figure shows the run timing for Sawtooth and Pacimeri hatchery Chinook salmon over Bonneville Dam. The black line shows Sawtooth hatchery returns, while the dotted red line shows Pacimeri hatchery returns. This is the average run timing over Bonneville from 2009 through 2018. As you can see, we generally don't start seeing fish destined for the Upper Salmon until about the end of April. We try to make our proposals for seasons to the IDFG Commission at their annual May meeting, which is usually somewhere around the 18th of May. The season's usually opening around the third week of June. Even waiting this long can be difficult. As you can see, we usually only have about 10 to 25% of the run crossing Bonneville Dam at that time. At times we've had to push these proposals back even further until we have more information. Last year was a good example of this, when we had to wait until June 16th to propose our seasons, upon which the Commission approved to open on June 26th. So as those runs cross Bonneville, we can then start to look at pit tag returns and timing and determine if the runs are early, late, or average and get an estimate of the overall run size. At that point, we move forward with in-season forecasts and start to determine survival between the dams and harvest shares, and then develop proposals for the Commission. As I mentioned before, those proposals generally go to the Commission at their May meeting with the intention of opening those fisheries around the third week of June. Joe briefly touched on the 2021 forecasts overall, but highlighted here are the forecasts for Pacimeri, Sawtooth, and Yankee Fork Salmon River hatchery returns. The return numbers here are forecasted to Lower Granite Dam and are obviously much lower than anyone would like to see. We're only anticipating about 250 adults returning to Pacimeri hatchery, only about 1,300 to Sawtooth hatchery, with an additional 250 returning to the Yankee Fork Salmon River. I should mention that the Yankee Fork returns are from a hatchery release of Sawtooth smolts in this drainage, and a large portion of those adults home back to Sawtooth hatchery. Shown here are the broodstock needs for the hatchery facilities in the Upper Salmon, and you can see that we'll likely fall short of broodstock at Pacimeri. Depending on how the return to Sawtooth shapes up and survival from Lower Granite Dam to the Upper Salmon, we should meet broodstock, but the numbers will have to come up well above the forecast before we're able to propose any fisheries in the Upper Salmon. The table on the bottom right shows the number of wild fish forecasted to return to the Upper Salmon River and its tributaries. I'll talk more about the significance of wild fish in our fisheries coming up. As we consider salmon seasons, there are two major factors that determine if and where we will be able to have a season. Joe talked about this in the introduction with our management goals and strategies. First off is the number of hatchery fish we have returning. This obviously is no surprise to most people, as all of our Chinook harvest is on hatchery fish. But first and foremost is that we have enough hatchery fish returning to fill those hatcheries with the next generation. Surplus fish above and beyond those numbers become harvest share. The harvest share is split 50-50 between tribal and non-tribal fisheries. I think most people already understand how the hatchery side and harvest share allocation works. But the other major factor that influences our ability to have fisheries, particularly in the Upper Salmon, is the number of wild fish returning to spawn in the Upper Salmon and its tributaries. Wild Chinook salmon in the Upper Salmon River are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, which means we have to consider the potential impacts to those fish in any fishery we conduct. We know that wild fish will be caught and released when we have salmon fisheries. Therefore, any fisheries we have must be approved and permitted by NOAA Fisheries. Those permits allow a certain amount of incidental take. Incidental take is unintended but not unexpected. So in this case, we're not targeting wild fish, but it's not unexpected that some will get caught by anglers. Take is defined as to harass, hunt, capture, kill, anything that might impact the survival of an ESA-listed species. And in this case, we acknowledge that some of those fish that are caught and released in our fisheries will likely die from that encounter. NOAA assigns a 10% mortality rate on Chinook caught and released, so for every 10 fish caught and released, we accrue 1 incidental mortality in our fisheries. And I should mention that this operates on a sliding scale. So as wild fish runs increase, our take levels also increase. I should also mention that wild returns can be low enough that we aren't allowed any incidental mortalities and therefore can't have fisheries. But generally speaking, our wild and hatchery returns track very closely. When one is up, so is the other, and vice versa. So if wild numbers are really low, we probably don't have much, if any, of a harvestable surplus of our hatchery fish. Conversely, if we have a really strong hatchery return, wild returns are usually doing pretty good also, and potential impacts to those populations are minimal. Next, I'll go into a little more detail on how this works out on the water when proposing and opening fisheries in the upper salmon. So there are 9 populations of wild Chinook in the upper Salmon River. Those are found in the major tributaries shown here: Panther Creek, North Fork Salmon River, Lemhi River, Pacimeri River, East Fork Salmon River, Yankee Fork Salmon River, and Valley Creek. There's also 2 additional populations that spawn within the main stem of the Salmon River. Also shown on this map are the locations of our 2 hatcheries in green stars, both Pacimeri and Sawtooth hatcheries. So as we propose fisheries in the upper Salmon River, we have to consider where those different wild populations may be encountered. For example, in this figure, if we open the Salmon River from just above the mouth of the Middle Fork all the way upstream to Sawtooth Hatchery, we have the potential to catch wild fish from all of those different populations that I listed before. And also, as an example, if we move that downstream boundary of the fishery to, say, somewhere between the Lemhi and the Pacimeri River, we've eliminated the potential impacts for those fish destined to Panther Creek, the North Fork salmon, and the Lemhi River in this example. So as you can see, depending on the wild fish returns, we can structure our fisheries to reduce impacts on certain populations where there may be concerns. The question often comes up is, how many wild fish do we need, and what is all this based on? So this table shows the 9 wild Chinook populations I just referenced previously, and a viability target. This viability target is also known as the minimum abundance threshold, or MAT. These numbers come from the Snake River Spring-Summer Chinook ESA recovery plan. So at a minimum, we need to be above the 30% mark of that viability number. So for example, to open the entire upper Salmon River in that example I showed before with a boundary just above the Middle Fork of the Salmon River, we'd need to have a wild return of at least 2,250 fish down to that mark. Now you can see here that wild forecasted return that I showed earlier in the presentation for 2021. You can see that we're well below that 30% minimum abundance threshold, and we don't get up to that 30% mark until we move upstream to around Valley Creek in the upper main stem of the Salmon River. I also mentioned earlier that those impacts are allowed on a sliding scale. So when there's a larger number of wild fish, there are more allowable impacts. If we aren't above that 30% mark, we're unable to fish in those areas. If we get above 30%, those impacts are allowed at a rate of 1.5% of the wild population. As we get closer to or even above that viability threshold, those allowable impacts increase. So what does this all mean from a fisheries management standpoint? Similar to what Joe talked about earlier, is that we have to do intensive creel monitoring of all of our fisheries. That involves angler counts and interviews to estimate angler effort, harvest, and catch rates. A lot of that's aimed at determining how close we're getting to our harvest share that our anglers are catching. But it also allows us to monitor those impacts we're having on those wild Chinook populations and track that amount of catch and release that we're seeing. So Joe gave a great overview of their management goals and the tools we can use to maximize angler satisfaction. And just like other fisheries across the state, we can use those tools as well in the Upper Salmon River. What we've done in the past is essentially tried to maximize the amount of river we can open to fishing for as long as possible and maximize the sport angler portion of the harvest share while staying within those constraints of the wild fish impacts and meeting our hatchery broodstock goals. Over the years, many of you know that we've had some fisheries that were only open for a very limited area, such as the reaches of the Salmon River just below Sawtooth Hatchery or just downstream of Samurai Hatchery. Other years, we've been able to open much more of the river from just above the mouth of the Middle Fork all the way up to Sawtooth, about 190 miles of the main stem Salmon River. So those fishery boundaries are based on that combination of hatchery broodstock needs and those wild Chinook returns. We've tried to open up as much of the Salmon River as we could based on those numbers. So I hope this gives a little bit of insight into how the seasons are set in the Upper Salmon River and some of the sideboards we need to work within. Although we don't have any formal fishery proposals for the Upper Salmon in 2021 right now, that may change as we see how the run develops later in the spring. Regardless, we'd still like to get your feedback on how you'd like to see seasons managed in the future in the Upper Salmon River. We'll be conducting an online survey in the coming months, and if you'd like to have your voice heard, please navigate to the IDFG Chinook Salmon Seasons proposal page, click on the Upper Salmon River Fisheries link, and please enter your contact info and email address. We'll email you a link to that survey as soon as it comes out. Thanks for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Also, I can be reached at the email shown here. Thanks again.